Hi, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the fifth live streaming EKU Chautauqua presentation, sponsored by Eastern Kentucky University's nationally prominent honors program and housed in the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences, My name is Eric Liddell, Chautauqua Lecture Series Coordinator, and I am delighted this evening to be joined by Ciaran O'Connor and John Wood Jr., of the braverangels.org national offices, along with Carolyn Dupont of EKU History and Kentucky State Coordinator of Braver Angels for tonight's presentation and discussion. So welcome to you all, and welcome to our viewers out there again. Braver Angels, if you don't know them yet, is a citizens movement to reduce political polarization in the United States by bringing liberals and conservatives together in civil discussion in order to understand each other beyond stereotypes by forming red-blue community alliances, teaching practical skills for communicating across political differences, and making a strong public argument for depolarization, something I suspect all of us steeped in this supercharged election season with its rhetoric would agree that we could all use and carry forward into the future. Let me introduce our guests in a little bit more detail. Ciaran O'Connor, who joins us from New York City, is Chief Marketing Officer for Braver Angels, and he previously served as a communications staffer for both the Obama 2012 and Clinton 2016 presidential campaigns. John Wood Jr., who joins us from LA, the other side of the country, is Director of Media Development and a national leader of Braver Angels. He's a former nominee for Congress who has served as vice chairman of the Republican Party of Los Angeles County and is the author of an upcoming book, Transcending Politics: Perspectives for a Divided Nation. And Carolyn Dupont is professor of history here at EKU, specializing in American history, women's history, and the history of the civil rights movement. She's the author of Mississippi Praying, White Religion and the Quest for Black Equality, which was published in 2013 with New York University Press. I should say Carolyn has been and is currently a candidate for public office and is the Kentucky State Coordinator of Better Angels, as I already mentioned. We are going to start with Carolyn and then turn things over to Ciaran and John. And our presenters together will take the first part of the hour, and then I will return for some discussion and some questions and answers. And to that end, I want to encourage our audience out there, all of the viewers on YouTube, to submit comments and questions right here in the YouTube chat, or if you prefer, via Twitter. Our handle there is @EKU Chautauqua, and so I'll be checking that as well. Full details of this year's schedule, including our next event 2 weeks from tonight to conclude our fall season, are on our website, and you can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter for updates and reminders. And so once again, I want to thank our guests for being here. I want to thank the sponsors of the event tonight, which include the EKU Departments of Government and Communication. And without further ado then, let me turn things over to Carolyn to get us started. And I'll let our three guests take over, and I will drop off the screen and return at the conclusion of the panel's remarks. So welcome again to all three of you. Go ahead and take it away, Carolyn.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eric. And I'm so delighted to be here. I do just want to slightly correct one thing that Eric said. I am the Kentucky State Coordinator for Braver Angels on hiatus, and I'll explain in a few moments why I'm on hiatus. But I want to just tell you briefly how I came to Braver Angels. As Dr. Liddell mentioned, I was a candidate for the Kentucky legislature in 2018. And the experience of running for office, for anyone who's done it, is one where you talk to a lot of people, and you talk to a lot of people who maybe aren't in the same bubble that you're in. And I think for me, that was the biggest revelation. It was a revelation about myself, that I lived in a bubble. And I so enjoyed the experience of getting out of that bubble and having meaningful conversations with people who didn't see eye to eye with me. And I did not win that election in 2018, but as soon as it was over, I had this sense of loss that those conversations were going to go away. And I so desperately wanted to keep having them because I sensed somehow that they mattered, and they mattered for my own personal growth as much as anything else. And so I began to seek out friendships with people that I knew were on the other side of the aisle, and to cultivate them in a meaningful way. And a wonderful thing happened. I realized that people that I had regarded with suspicion, I actually became very fond of. And what I learned is that suspicion had resided in me. It was not a product of them. So, and it was just a few months after that election in 2018 that I heard about what at the time was called Better Angels. And as a historian, I just have to mention that comes from Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address. And became connected with the organization, went to the convention in May of 2019 in St. Louis. It was a marvelous experience. I continued to have those wonderful conversations that to me are one of the best things in life. And left that meeting very enthusiastic about the mission of Braver Angels and became Kentucky State Coordinator. Now, I was only in that position about maybe 7 months before my state representative announced he was not running again, and that seat was open, and by golly, I had to try again. And so when I began running for state representative from my district here in Jessamine County, Kentucky, I took a hiatus from Braver Angels. But I just want to say that, again, I'm out talking to people outside of my bubble. And I'm talking to them about issues, the things that I think are important for our state to be doing. And to me, that's investing in public education and securing healthcare. But I also talk to them about restoring decency to our politics and finding a way that we can begin to communicate with one another beyond beyond stereotypes, beyond hurling insults, and reach a greater understanding. And I find that it's that aspect of the conversation, not the issues that people are most hungry to hear about. And I would even say that people are craving profoundly some kind of a return to this. And even in the last week, I've had conversations with 2 Republicans. I'm a Democrat. And both of them said to me, I don't know if I'm going to vote for you or not. But we sat there and had 45-minute conversations about what it would mean to really begin to communicate with one another again. And honestly, after those conversations, I'm not sure I care if they vote for me or not. It's just been a wonderfully rewarding experience. And some things I'd just like to note before I hand it over to Ciaran and John is that whatever happens on November 3rd, whether it's what you like or don't like, what you're hoping for, or whether you're disappointed, we know that large groups of people either way are going to be disappointed, and large groups will be happy. But the people on the other side of the aisle are not disappearing. They will still be there. And whatever it is that has brought us to this place in 2016 will still need to be addressed. I think that one of the things that I have come to learn about politics, so often we think it's about who wins and who gets to dominate and who gets to call the shots. And I suppose that's a part of it. But I think there can also be a kind of politics where we focus more on getting buy-in from people on the other side. And I just have to end with an anecdote from American history. One of my favorite, I'll admit I have a favorite founding father, and that's James Madison. And I think so many Americans don't know the full story of how we got the Bill of Rights. When the Constitution was signed and ratified, it had no Bill of Rights, and almost no one at the Constitutional Convention thought it needed one. James Madison was most adamant about it not needing a Bill of Rights, and I won't go into the reasons why he didn't think it needed one. They're complicated. But during the ratification process, so many Americans expressed their concern and their great desire that the federal Constitution should have a Bill of Rights. And Madison, instead of digging in his heels and saying, no, I'm right about this, actually said, okay, this is something I'm hearing in such a, from so many quarters. He began to work on a Bill of Rights. And over the next 2 years, as he became a congressman in the first Congress, saw the first 10 amendments through to ratification and adding them to the Constitution, he changed his mind. So the process of listening to other people can sometimes change us. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm not advocating, and I don't think Ciaran and John are advocating that we back off of our convictions. It's not about anything such as that. But it is about dropping the self-righteousness that says, I'm the only one, I'm the one who has the corner on the truth here. And I think it's a very exciting journey to be on, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Ciaran and John have to say to us tonight. It is a great privilege and honor to be part of this, and now I will turn it over to you guys. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Eric, for bringing us all together, and thanks to all of you who are taking this time on a Thursday night to participate in a civic activity on the brink of our election. And Carolyn, I have to say that was one of the most clear and compelling cases that I've heard for Braver Angels. And as somebody whose job it is to spread the gospel, so to speak, I can't wait to have you back into the fold. And I also, of course, wish you luck on Tuesday. I also appreciate you sharing your personal story, because I noticed some potential interesting overlaps with my partner, John, who I will let introduce himself in a moment. But first, I just wanted to outline a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about who we are, why we're drawn to this work. We'll talk a little bit about the problem of polarization. Obviously, I think all of you at home know that this is a problem, but we're going to talk a little bit about why polarization has deepened so much and become such a threat to democracy. I'm going to tell the story of Braver Angels from, a merry band of brothers who went around doing workshops to the largest citizens movement in the country, working to depolarize the country. And lastly, we will talk about Election Day and what is on tap for Braver Angels. Originally, John and I were scheduled to come to EKU in person. Neither of us has been to Kentucky before, so we're really looking forward. Obviously, because of COVID, we were not able to do that, but it means that we get to talk to you on the brink of the election. And obviously, the stakes of this issue couldn't be higher. So before I ramble on here, why don't I turn things over to John? John, tell the people who you are and why you're here.
Absolutely. So yeah, my name is John Wood Jr. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to hear that introduction from Eric and that wonderful and that wonderful overview from Carolyn. Yeah, pretty good at making the pitch for Braver Angels. Ciaran, I sort of thought that we could just sort of kick back and, go home after that. She more or less said it all. But to say a little bit about myself. So I'm formerly a nominee for Congress, which was mentioned. I ran for Congress at the age of 26. I was 27 on Election Day. And I was the youngest active nominee for Congress in the state of California, ran in the California 43rd. And it was predominantly a Democratic-leaning district, but with pockets of Republicans. And so at that young an age and without too much on my
resume to recommend me for office, at that point, people would ask, well, what makes you qualified to represent a district as diverse and complex as the California 43rd? And I would, whether I was speaking to a Black Democratic church in South LA, inner city South Los Angeles, or to a white Tea Party club in South Bay LA County, I would have the same response. I'd say, well, I come from an interesting sort of family background. My mother's liberal Black Democrat from inner city LA. My father's a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I sort of grew up explaining my mother to my father to my mother. And that's why I think I can represent a lot of you. And that tended to be something that that got a laugh. But the truth is that I am a person who's sort of grown up in cultural and political intersections. And I have found that to be a useful sort of backdrop for this work, in part because it instills within me the conviction that at the end of the day, even though it is the case that we've come to see one another, we've come to see Democrats and Republicans as the enemy in so much of American life. For me, Democrats and Republicans have always been mom and dad in a nutshell. And when you remember that the people who the narratives that present themselves through our partisan media are referring to on just sort of the grassroots community level in American life, when you remember that these folks are not adequately described as, as simply fascists or communists or, extremists or bigots or whatever the case may be, when you remember that humanity tends to be more complex than that, even if we are rightfully concerned about the political points of view that the people we disagree with hold, it equips us with an understanding of the problem of polarization that allows us to be more thoughtful in how we engage one another. So let me make this point in talking about the problem of polarization. We genuinely do look at each other as enemies in American life today. If you go back and look at polling from the 1970s and even earlier, you'll see that large majorities of the American people considered Americans from the other party to be people that they disagreed with, but who still loved this country just like they love their country, right? Whether you're Democrats talking about Republicans and vice versa. We still had reasonable feelings of respect for each other on the level of party affiliation across the partisan line. You fast forward into the 20th century, close to majorities of Americans, according to the polls that we've seen, believe that the other party is actively harming the welfare of the country, that the other party is filled with people who are actively undermining the well-being of the United States of America. And so these are strikingly different attitudes. If you look at the first televised presidential debate between then Vice President Richard Nixon and Senator John F. Kennedy, you'll find a moment in that debate where Kennedy says that he wants to make it clear to the American people that the differences between him and Kennedy are over matters of policy, are over issues and how to go about governing the country, but that they are the same in their love for America. He established a sense of camaraderie with his Democratic opponent. You fast forward a few decades up to now, and I can remember in the first round of presidential debates that President Trump participated in with his Democratic opponent, with Hillary Clinton, there was a point at which he basically makes the point that he'd be willing to lock her up if he was president, right? And whether you're serious about that or not, it signaled just sort of this radical sprint downward in terms of the way we feel about each other that is reflected on the highest levels of our politics, but that really sort of germinates and becomes cancerous in the relationships that exist between the American people themselves. A big part of the case we want to make about the problem of polarization is that on the one hand, it is something that seeps into our relationships and makes it more and more difficult for us to actually live together as Americans in community, to be able to work together as professionals, to be able to share spaces of education together, to keep our families together. At Braver Angels, and Ciaran will talk more about the details of our work, but at Braver Angels, part of what we do is we engage folks who are having difficulty maintaining relationships in their personal lives because of politics. Polarization tends to destroy the social fabric, but in doing that, it also makes it harder. It also makes it hard to impossible for us to govern society effectively on the political level and on the institutional level. Because suddenly, in order for politicians to get elected, in order for certain agendas to get passed, the idea has increasingly become not to achieve consensus and buy-in across the sort of ideological diversity of American life, but rather to pit Americans against each other in various groups in order to get just enough support to get reelected, in order to get just enough support to get a bill across. But in the meantime, the culture of goodwill that is meant to sustain a workable politics winds up collapsing on the social level. And that means our institutions come down on top of it. And so that's part of the connection that we seek to draw. And I think part of the larger problem that brought Braver Angels, part of the larger analysis that spurred Braver Angels to come into existence in the first place. And so, Ciaran, do you want to talk a little bit about the origin story of Braver Angels?
Yes, thank you, John. And first, I'll just say a little bit about myself, because it's sort of my own story that led into Braver Angels. And as I mentioned at Braver Angels, we really believe in the power of stories and the power of people, individuals, families, communities, because so often people see politics as a game of talking points or abstractions, or, you know, Trump did this, or McConnell did this, or Biden did this. And that's all very important. But at the end of the day, it springs from ourselves. And ultimately, what we are working on first and foremost is how we treat one another and the trust that we can build together, because from that trust springs the ability to work with one another. For my part, I was born and raised in New York City. Both my parents are journalists. I think it's safe to say they lean liberal. I grew up in a liberal place. I went to a liberal high school, and I went to a liberal university. Growing up in New York, I was always someone who prided myself on diversity. You know, taking the subway to school every day, I was surrounded by people from all over the world, of all races, of all walks of life. I mean, you know, you would have a homeless guy sitting next to a Wall Street banker, and someone from Nigeria next to someone from Brooklyn. So I always considered myself as somebody who understood the value of diversity. I got into politics after graduating college. I worked on the Obama campaign in 2012. And as Eric mentioned, I also worked on the Clinton campaign in 2016. And the Clinton campaign was a very instructive experience for me because of how it ended, how devastated I was, how devastated everyone in my circle was. And I came to realize that for someone who prided himself on appreciating diversity, I didn't actually really have much political diversity in my life. And I realized that in some ways, my perception of conservatives was very much driven by stereotypes. And I was concerned that the problem of polarization was deeper than just the partisan warfare. You know, as I said, I was devastated when Clinton lost, and I wanted to do everything that I could to resist the Trump administration insofar as I wanted to fight back against policies that I disagreed with. But I also wanted to investigate my country. You know, you guys are, for the most part, I presume, from Kentucky, which leans red. But, you know, I imagine at EKU, there's a fairly rich balance of Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives. And so then it was that I found out about an organization. At that time, we were called Better Angels. As Carolyn pointed out, we are named after Lincoln originally, who, in taking office in 1861, addressing a nation on the brink of civil war, he called on us to summon our better angels, the idea that we all have a higher, more transcendent being, that we have our better angels and our worst devils. And of course, he was trying to hold the nation together. But it was the idea that we didn't have to look elsewhere to necessarily find this elevated state of empathy and humanity and patriotism. We could find it within ourselves. Over time, of course, we had a civil war. And I think in some ways we are at a similar place today, and that's what makes the gravity of this issue so heavy. So when I joined Better Angels, it was really little more than an idea. We had developed a workshop, a red-blue workshop, basically a workshop that brought together a number of liberals, say 6 or 7 liberals and 6 or 7 conservatives in a community for a series of exercises that were based on family therapy, in particular couples therapy. Our colleague, Bill Doherty, he's a professor at the University of Minnesota, the grandfather of our workshops. He is a longtime family therapist who specializes on working with couples who are on the brink of divorce. And as Carolyn mentioned, it's possible that we are on the brink of a civic divorce. And we're wondering, how can we hold our country together? Could we learn from these techniques that help couples who are fighting and who have lost trust and are suspicious of one another, help those couples talk to one another, help them begin to rebuild the bonds that brought them together and kept them together? And so we developed this workshop. It's a series of exercises that are designed to help the two sides understand each other better in their own words. So much of how we understand the other side is driven not from our actual exposure and conversations, but through our own partisan tribal bubble, right? So if I'm a liberal living in New York City, all my friends are liberal. I spend an hour every night watching MSNBC and scrolling Twitter and following people who agree with me. I'm going to have a warped and stereotyped version of conservatives. Likewise, if I live in a county that voted for Trump overwhelmingly and all my friends voted for Trump, and I spend an hour every day watching Fox News, I'm going to have a very distorted picture of liberals. So we actually bring people together, but do it in a non-confrontational way where they're not just fighting off the bat or trying to score points. We have exercises where people can listen to the other side in their own words. And that's powerful because it reveals the nuance and the broad spectrum of ideas and hopes and fears and lived experiences that have led people to how they view the world and how they see their ideology manifest in their relationships. And it's very powerful for people to hear each other's experiences and stories, because even if they don't necessarily agree, they can start to empathize. They can see how another person arrived at the position they're at, and they can see that we all want the best for our country, even if we disagree strongly about what is best for our country. And so from that workshop sprang other programs because it was successful. We were able to bring these folks together and create alliances, that is to say, liberals and conservatives in a community who continue to meet together in an ongoing basis to take up issues of common concern, to socialize, to spread more workshops. We started doing workshops throughout the country. We developed debates, which have been very popular and effective in 2020 because it's an election year. And as Carolyn alluded to, we don't necessarily require people to agree. We don't want people to think that we are a centrist organization where people feel like they have to compromise their values or meet in the middle or paper over these very real disagreements. But we do want to build ways for people to get to know each other better as humans and start to build that baseline of trust. And so we took that approach to the election and developed a series of debates. How could we talk about the most difficult issues in a way that allowed for passion and vigor, but didn't allow for vitriol and bad faith destruction of another person? And we talked about abortion. We talked about gun rights. We talked about the election itself. On Tuesday, we actually had a debate with about 1,000 people where the actual topic was, should you vote for Biden or Trump? And obviously the range of opinions expressed were very different and very passionate, but they were done in a way that people could actually listen and understand and grapple with, rather than just be in a reflexive, defensive posture. So that's kind of the story of Braver Angels, how we've grown our programming. We've now become a membership organization. We have about 11,000 members nationwide. And I'll let John just say a little bit more about our approach on a moral and spiritual level, and the tradition of nonviolence that really informs a lot of our work. And then I think we'll end by just talking a little bit about what we have coming up. How can you all get involved if you think this work is important? How can you help spread the activities of bridge building and empathetic conversation in your own communities and in your own politics? So John, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a lot of different influences at Braver Angels in terms of different facets of the sort of American traditions and just, different sort of philosophical perspectives in general that go into how we execute our work, how we conceptualize it, and how we talk about it. For myself and for many at Braver Angels, there's a deep resonance with the philosophy of nonviolence as it was taught and as it was practiced by Martin Luther King Jr. and Bayard Rustin and others from that era. And one of the things I want to mention about that, because it's interesting, the tradition of nonviolence led to some of the most profound transformations of American moral and cultural life leading out of the 1960s, helping people to go beyond, to cross and to transcend the racial and social divisions of the time in a way that set the stage for a transformation in the conscience of much of the American people. And yet we sort of forget a little bit in terms of what was actually taught in the midst of that movement. Nonviolence begins with this supposition that love is a social value that can be applied to social questions, that there is power in loving your opponent, in loving the people who even hate you, for a couple of reasons. One, because it allows you to speak more effectively to the conscience of the person who disagrees with you. It allows you to be more persuasive because you're able to signal to that person that you are not an enemy, but somebody who is disagreeing, somebody who is seeking to speak truth, somebody who is pushing for a certain change, but who nevertheless is seeking to do so, not just to make life better for yourself, but for the other individual as well, or for the other group as well. So love, which King also defined as, King defined love in terms of it being akin to what is called agape love in the sort of the Greek tradition or the New Testament tradition, which you can basically think of as the idea of goodwill, right? King was very clear that he didn't mean love in terms of affection or sort of sentimentalism, right? At a certain point, he said that he's very grateful that the idea is not that you have to like your enemy, because it's hard to like people who are mistreating you or who would necessarily perhaps advocate for things that are contrary to your well-being. But love or goodwill is something that has the capacity to reach the individual who disagrees with you. And even if it fails to do that, it succeeds in removing from ourselves the albatross, the psychological albatross of bitterness, of judgment, of hatred or fear. Because ultimately it sort of liberates us to think less in terms of condemning the other person and more in terms of engaging and speaking to whatever state of ignorance or error we might think the other person of, as being in the grips of, if you will. And so that is a strikingly different disposition morally to go into the work of politics and activism and bridge building with, than a position that says that I'm going to judge people as human beings on the basis of their politics, on the basis of the opinions that they hold, without making a distinction between the opinions we might hold in a given moment and who we actually are, what we at least have the potential to be as human beings, right? And so in Braver Angels, one of the things that we actively teach is the process by which we might go about disciplining our own internal attitudes towards one another across lines of party, politics, etc. We actually have something called a depolarizing within workshop that zeroes in on ways in which we can evaluate how is it we may be sort of thinking in ways that are pejorative or stereotypical towards the other side. How is it we may be entertaining internal dialogues that are sort of priming us to engage others in ways that are more hostile or more defensive. And from there, sort of highlights avenues by which we can begin to discipline ourselves to think in more nuanced terms about people with different points of view, in more charitable terms, disciplining ourselves to seek out more thoughtful versions of opposing arguments, as opposed to being content to receive the weakest and the most inflammatory positions fed to us perhaps through partisan media, by which we may sometimes find ourselves justified in painting all people of a certain political party or persuasion with a certain broad brush. And in this, we psychologically arm ourselves to be able to venture into difficult conversations with a spirit of charity and of grace, really. Now, to say that it is important for us to be charitable, to say that it is important for us to be to seek the best in others, is not to say that it is an easy thing to engage in these conversations, to just sort of be nice and polite, and to expect that necessarily to, one, protect ourselves from, from the wounds that we can experience when we venture out into these conversations, or two, it's not to say that being polite is enough to be able to reach somebody else's thinking, if that's what you want to do. If we're taking the example of the nonviolent movement, having goodwill for the opponent was something that motivated people like Dr. King and the activists of that era to literally suffer physical abuse in that effort, right? So we're not presenting this way of looking at social engagement as an easy thing, far from it. And in fact, that's a big part of why better angels became braver angels to begin with, because one thing that we realized was that while empathy is a vital component for building bridges and being able to reestablish the relationships that can begin to produce the norms that we seek to have scale up in our culture, so as to ultimately affect politics on the higher level, on the structural level, through shifts that take place in society and culture. And so a huge part of what we do is to build out the organizing infrastructure and the sort of curricular infrastructure for that change to take place in society. But it takes more than just empathy. It takes genuine courage to do this. It really does. It takes the courage to be able to stand in the face of people who disagree with you, who will distrust you, and possibly in certain cases be willing to act somewhat abusively towards you because they distrust you because you're from the other party. But it also takes courage to be able to have that attitude of charity towards folks on the other side of the question, because oftentimes in so doing, we invite the judgment and even the condemnation sometimes of our friends, or at least of people who do think like us politically, but who suspect that being willing to be empathetic towards folks on the other side, to strive for that common ground, is to sell out in some form or fashion. When really what it is to set the stage for us to be able to start rebuilding community and democracy together. Dr. King said of nonviolence that the aim of nonviolence is not to defeat or humiliate the opponent, which is, quite in contrast to some of the aspects of what we might call, cancel culture. And this is right and left, by the way, the tendency to demonize people and to want to ostracize people on the basis of their political points of view is very much in fashion today. It's why we exist. But King said that the aim of nonviolence was not to defeat or humiliate the opponent, but to earn his understanding and to win his friendship, so that ultimately we may build the beloved community together. And so this idea of a beloved community and, this idea of a more perfect union, which is obviously a phrase that goes back very far in American history, this idea of e pluribus unum, that out of many we are one. There's something in the idealism of American society that, even though we have been founded in so many different divisions and so many different moral stains, that it is important for us to reflect upon in understanding not just our history, but our present moment. There's nevertheless an idealism in this country that paints a picture that says that in all of our differences, across racial lines, across religious lines, and yes, I would argue across philosophical lines, liberalism, conservatism, etc., left and right, given the fact that we are all human beings who share an interest in the well-being of society, there are ways in which our differences don't necessarily serve simply to conflict with each other, but to complete each other at the end of the day. There is an American family that we are seeking to build and rebuild, something that maybe never existed in its ideal state, but because of the work of folks like Dr. King and others who have strived for social progress in a reconciliatory fashion, gives us something to strive for in the work of Braver Angels. And I think that this goes for many folks in America in this larger movement towards unity and towards empathy, what we would call patriotic empathy at Braver Angels. This idea that your love for your country is demonstrated by your concern for your neighbor. This is the type of society that we're seeking to build, and this is the philosophy of humanization as opposed to demonization that motivates us in seeking to get there. So, Ciaran, I don't know if you want to pick it up on that note to give folks a little more details on what that looks like.
Yeah, thanks, John. That's very well said. And I think we have just a few minutes left because I want to leave time for questions. I want to pick up on one thing John said and then just talk a little bit about where Braver Angels is now and what we're doing around the election and in the immediate aftermath. And just because I think if there are folks out there who are nodding their heads or find this inspiring, there are some pretty powerful ways to get involved. John mentioned the notion of courage, and as I mentioned, we started as Better Angels. We are now Braver Angels. One of the things we really emphasize is bravery and courage, and the courage required to do this kind of work. You know, empathy, respect, compassion, those are all necessary, but they're not necessarily sufficient. In 2020, in an election season, it actually takes courage to have these conversations, not just the courage to withstand the insults and even maybe the violence that you're going to receive from people who disagree with you, but also to withstand the judgment that you may receive from your friends, folks on your own side who accuse you of being a sellout or accuse you of being naive or fraternizing with the enemy or somehow abandoning the cause because you're willing to have a conversation. It takes courage to withstand that kind of judgment because you believe in the power of conversation. And that's one of the reasons that we are now Braver Angels. And we think that that is a perfect name for 2020. The last thing I'll say is that our current initiative to help the country, to be of service to the country, is called Hold America Together. We recognize that the election on Tuesday could produce a contested election. You know, we could have a scenario in which two men are claiming to be president and large segments of America think the other side is trying to steal the election. We could have a scenario in which there's violence in the streets. And so Braver Angels has released a public letter. It's called What We Will Do to Hold America Together. It essentially calls upon us to embrace a higher partisanship, to reject violence, and to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. And if there is a contested election, to work together in solutions that are grounded in the Constitution. So I would encourage all of you out there, if you believe in that message, please sign our letter. You'll be joining thousands of other Americans, including elected officials, current members of Congress, media figures, academics who have lent their name as signatories. And it's not just a letter, the Hold America Together campaign. That's kind of our public statement, our statement of purpose. But then we also offer people the opportunity to organize Hold America Together gatherings in the wake of an election or during an ongoing election crisis. These are essentially self-organized gatherings of friends, families, and community members that are geared toward processing the election and doing it in a way that respects the opinions of both sides, but still seeks to hold friendships, families, communities together. We've developed templates for these conversations that take place as part of a larger initiative called With Malice Toward None. As Carolyn mentioned, we really love Lincoln at Braver Angels. With Malice Toward None is taken from Lincoln's second inaugural address. So when he was re-inaugurated after the Civil War, and the task in front of him was to rebuild a fractured nation that had been decimated by war and ravaged by war. And so we seek to help the nation bind up its wounds with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right. And so we've developed templates that are aimed to guide these discussions. whether you are disappointed or delighted, devastated or jumping for joy or breathing a sigh of relief. We want to help people come together with malice toward none, including organizations. So in addition to individuals, we've also recruited institutions, colleges, civic groups, churches, communities of faith to hold these gatherings, to give people a place to put these emotions that really could lead to violence if people don't, summon the better angels of our nature. So if any of you are interested in that, you can go to our website, you can easily sign up, and you can get sort of a more specific taste for what exactly it is I'm talking about. Because we actually have templates for discussions, even if you just want to have a discussion with 4 of your friends after the election, even if you all voted the same way and won, think about how you're going to move forward. Are you going to spike the football and say, okay, we won power, screw the other side? Or are you going to try to think about how we can still work together with the recognition that, as Carolyn said, the tens of millions of Americans who voted differently are not going anywhere. And in many cases, like with John, these are members of your family. These are your friends. These are your fellow classmates. And you have to decide if you want to maintain and strengthen those relationships, or if you really want to let politics continue to do what it's doing to so many people, which is to shred those relationships. But Braver Angels really exists as a source of hope and inspiration, but also as a resource. It's not just rhetoric and inspiring speeches, but it's on the ground organizing. It's doing the tough work of citizenship that we help people do. And we're really a citizen-driven movement, a volunteer-driven movement. Folks like Carolyn get involved. They start to host workshops. They see the power of the work. They become volunteers. They become coordinators. And they start bringing this work to their community. And so I'd encourage all of you, if you're interested, to consider how you might get involved. And with that, I'd love to turn things over to Eric so we can have more of an interactive conversation, because we'd really love to hear from you all tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ciaran, and John, and Carolyn as well, who I assume will be joining us again momentarily. There she is. Thank you, all 3 of you, for that rich and illuminating and inspiring discussion. I will see if Carolyn has something immediately she would like to say to kind of keep this on-screen discussion going, but we do also have some questions that I'll get to from the audience out there. Carolyn, is there something you wanted to bring up? I don't want to put you on the spot, but.
No, it's fine. I was jotting things down because what Ciaran and John were saying just, it sparked all kinds of thoughts, but I'll just say one thing, and that is no one is coming to save us. We have to do this.
Right.
And if we want to find a way to, I think of George H.W. Bush, be a kinder, gentler nation, a nation with more unity of purpose, even though we have different ideas about policies. It's up to us. There's not a magic leader who's going to be able to fix this.
The power is with us people if we know how to seize it and turn it to best advantage. I think that's a thread running through this for sure. And indeed, I guess kind of connected to that notion, one of our viewers out there commented, I think this was when Ciaran was talking about the workshop exercises that were initially developed somewhat on the basis of couples therapy, which is fascinating in itself. But the comment is, this is an interesting model for civic literacy, right? And one thing I would kind of, I guess, draw out of that is a question about your views on the status of civic literacy. I would assume you get a pretty decent sense of this at your workshops and in the debates that you host. What's your sense of that among both, let's say, politicians? I don't want to just say typical politicians, but politicians who have worked their way up through the ranks, have more or less gone through a kind of shaping process, maybe in their own parties. What's your sense of their civic literacy or their commitment to the kind of civic discourse that you're talking about? Like, for example, do they need sensitivity training before they get sworn into Congress? And I kind of ask that jokingly, but, would it be valuable for them to go through the type of workshop process that you're talking about? So their civic literacy, but then also, broadly speaking, civic literacy among the broader populace. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, to start, I mean, we would love to do workshops with, every single member of Congress, because I think it could be valuable. I think that civic literacy is an interesting way to think about things, and it also speaks to the notion of trust. Because in order to be literate, you have to trust the information that you are exposed to is accurate, and you have to operate in a system with your fellow citizens that, at least to some extent, there's a shared reality or a shared foundation upon which you are discussing these issues. And given just how fragmented and balkanized our media ecosystem has become, and how much the publishers and purveyors of content like Facebook and Twitter and Google are driven by monetary considerations, where it's in their interest to serve you provocative content that is going to confirm your biases and sort of put you in this algorithmic spiral where you're just seeing more and more information that kind of confirms your worldview and paints the other side as kind of these people who are hell-bent on destroying the country. It makes the work so much harder. And then on top of that, I think our politicians increasingly feel permission frankly, to act like school children. And the reason is because it works. There's a lot of people who have gotten elected by just being cruel and, being kind of shameless, right? And there are people who have lost office because they refuse to do that. And so I think this kind of behavior has become normalized and it's become the new norm. And then it's really like not a good model for citizens because, citizens see, well, such and such politician is like this, and look, they're, keeping office and they're pushing through their priorities and they're kind of saying, screw you. It kind of gives permission for the citizens to do that. And so I think what we're trying to build is more of like a reclamation of those norms of decency. But I think there's a bit of a chicken or egg problem, because in order to appreciate the value of those norms, you kind of have to experience it, right? Like you didn't necessarily know you were thirsty until you, drank from the well of braver angels, and to torture this metaphor, tasted that sweet spring water. But John, is there anything you want to add to that question?
Yeah, well, so civic literacy. Yeah, I mean, so if you're talking about just in terms of how knowledgeable do people tend to be about the workings of our political system, about the ways in which citizens get involved and whatnot. I do think that knowledge base tends to be a bit higher with some older people. Maybe this is subjective, but I feel like with some younger folks, it's not, the threshold is a little bit lower there, although certainly not at EKU, I would imagine. But there's this broader sort of question that Ciaran sort of touched on a bit, which is, it's not just about civic literacy, but it's sort of this issue of, do people share the same facts, and does that set the stage for us to be able to have a conversation that can allow us to cross divides? And I agree with Ciaran that is a challenge, but what I would say is that in terms of baptizing people into the kind of culture of empathy and listening that we're talking about, there's a reason why goodwill is the starting point, because somebody could be coming from a place, just another universe in terms of believing conspiracy theories of a certain kind, or one narrative or the other. And if we disagree on that sort of reality, it can be hard in a way to have policy-based conversations. And yet, if you are able to set the stage to where, regardless of what the person is saying, you are able to hear their story and hear the humanity within it, because everybody has a story to tell in terms of why they see things the way that they do. If you can listen to that, you purchase the opportunity for yourself to return to be able to articulate your own story. And in that context, you begin to establish trust. You begin to establish a relationship that yields trust on a personal level. Once a person gets to the point of looking at the other individual and saying, okay, I don't see things the way this person does, but I can tell they're not an enemy, in just the way Carolyn was describing in her conversations with Republicans in her district, then you open the space for a conversation that can go deeper in terms of, okay, so where do you get your information on this? Because I'm curious, because my understanding of this issue is a lot different. This is my understanding of what the facts are, what the data is, et cetera, et cetera. You begin to make the space less threatening and therefore more inviting of reflection, right? And so we bring people into those sorts of spaces, and that allows for some correction to take place in terms of our mutual appreciation of what the details of the issues actually are. But without setting that context, very difficult to get to a place to where, folks with even the same basic set of facts can overcome their differing interpretations of them, much less to set the stage for people who have wildly different, facts, so to speak, to be able to have that kind of a dialogue. So it begins with establishing that empathetic foundation, that relational foundation, and going from there.
To kind of tie this into another question, do you think that establishing that foundation is something that needs to be done in, say, the high schools and in the college curriculum? I mean, I think Ciaran mentioned that some of the workshops have already been, as it were, developed into templates that could be used right in those venues. But do you think that, and I'm building upon John's sort of generational comment here, that perhaps people of my generation or older got I don't want to say a proper civics education in high school, but I remember my civics class to this day. But what it largely involved was learning, the details of the machinations and the operations and so on of government and the constitutional, foundations and so on. And it may be that, from a former time, that was maybe sufficient at a time when the trust and the erosion in our institutions had not reached the point it's at now, which, by the way, was exactly what our speaker, Morgan Marietta, was talking about last week, this problem of the erosion of trust, which then erodes the foundation that might serve, to bring us together factually and in a search for truth and so on, to have a meaningful conversation. But it strikes me that what you were just describing, John, may be something that in order, to accomplish the goal of giving people that experience now and to fight against the chaos of contemporary media, right, and just the propagandistic approach that many media outlets and politicians take, that's something that perhaps could and should be incorporated into high school classes. That is to say, these experiences, right? Not just let's learn the history, let's learn the facts of, the American way, but let's, undertake these types of discussions, in a structured way so that the next generation, to put it that way, has the wherewithal, to, as it were, to fight back or to withstand the onslaught, right, of contemporary media, and the distortions and the conspiracy theories. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I have a friend, my friend David Hadley, who's an assemblyman in California, made the point that he believed that we ought to have, instead of just having exchange programs that, allow a student from Los Angeles or New York City to go to Paris or Tokyo or London or what have you, we ought to be having exchange programs that send students from the city a couple of hours south to go hang out in the rural county, within their state, and vice versa. Because there are ways in which big city life is there are aspects of it that are fairly consistent all around the world. And actually, growing up in Los Angeles, Ciaran growing up in New York, is very different places, but the politics of cities tend to be different. There's, I won't go too deep into the geography here, but, we know cities tend to be more progressive and so forth. And even though I'm more conservative, there's ways in which our experiences can overlap a bit. on that level. Whereas within the state of California, if you just go up north of Los Angeles for a few hours, suddenly you're in miles and miles worth of farmland, where the values there, where the population density is lower, the style of life is very much different. Government is much more laissez-faire, and really the types of perspectives that come out of that part of California are much more similar to what you're going to get across much of the South and in parts of the Midwest. And so I do think that there are ways in which in our curriculums, both in terms of teaching skills, teaching maybe some of the programs and practices that we're working on here at Braver Angels, but also in terms of fostering cultural exposure that certainly, prioritizes exposing people to, diverse ethnicities and other cultural experiences, but including political diversity, including exposure across geographic lines, even within our country. To just go back to the story Ciaran told about himself, how it took sort of getting into adulthood to be able to bring in more ideological diversity into his social spheres. That's something that I think we could accomplish much earlier in American life. Well, it's hardly a reliable part of our civics education at all. So yeah, Eric, I think that's a great idea, and it would give us more to do at Braver Angels. Excuse to step onto some of these high school campuses a bit more.
Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in on that? I've got several more questions to share as well, but go ahead, Ciaran, if you have something to add.
Yeah, I was just going to say that in addition to civic literacy, I think the other piece of this is news literacy, and helping students sort fact from fiction and identify bias. And I think we don't need to go too deep into this, but in the past there was much fewer, more trusted media outlets, whereas now it's kind of like pick your own adventure. And I think that it's really important in this kind of wild, wild west that students learn about different sources of news. What is an outlet's standards for fact checking? When can you tell when something is kind of has a naked partisan agenda versus a deeply reported story with vetted sources? So I think civic literacy, but also news literacy, because I think one thing we hear in our workshop from both sides is that the media is dividing us. And I think that's true. But I think if you can kind of force yourself to get outside your filter bubble, you actually have a much fuller understanding of issues, and you actually have a better chance at persuading people if that's your goal.
Well, you read our questioner's mind. While John was talking, she added that civic literacy can be broader and deeper. It's about moral and civic history, but also, and great constitutional debates, but also implicit bias and the different ways we perceive the world, and the way that's, whatever, conditioned in terms of the information we access. And she adds, yes, on the news literacy, idea as well. Let's see. Okay. Several more questions here. Where was, okay. Here is a kind of psychological question. I think it was John mentioned the idea of inner depolarization, or I can't remember your exact phrase, but something like that, right? And the self-discipline required, in addition to the courage required to undertake this kind of conversation and to keep doing it. And not just because you have the fortune to be a candidate, right, who talks to a lot of people, but as a practice in your regular life. But the question is, when we catch ourselves thinking judgmental or non-charitable thoughts, what's the first thing we might say to ourselves to coach us through to a better place or attitude?
Right. Well, that's a great question. Look, I think that one of the reasons why in our Depolarizing Within workshops, we stress becoming acquainted with some of the more nuanced and some of just the best versions of the other arguments that are out there, right? If you're trying to understand conservatism, don't just listen to somebody who's screaming like a crazy person and is paid to do so on cable, news or talk radio, read some Thomas Sowell, read Charles Krauthammer or George Will, start taking in the folks who are really, really dedicated to the deeper sorts of foundations of the philosophy that's being represented. It's because we want to be able to generate other images of who the other folks are that more accurately kind of shows the origins of, of these different ways of seeing the world. So, I mean, that's one thing, just being able to expose yourself to a deeper and a greater sort of range of those perspectives beyond the stereotypical ones that we have thrown at us all the time is important. I mean, beyond that, my answer to that is to remember that human beings we are all of us, in so many respects, products of our environment. We're products of our upbringings, the things that we've experienced. Of course, you can have somebody who experiences a general environment and winds up thinking differently from most of the people around them. But even at that, we all exist as unique combinations of nurture and nature that produces as what we are. And so one of the reasons why in religious literature and in the teachings of nonviolence and so many moral traditions, there is this insistence that we not be quick to judge one another. It's because none of us has a perfect window into everything that made the other person think the way that they think, act the way that they act, and feel the way that they feel. So if we just sort of keep in mind that this other person is a human being who has experienced things that you have not, who has a story that is deep and complex as yours is, whatever it happens to be, that breeds a feeling of humility, in me at least, that gives me sort of an emotion that says, let me reserve my judgment and listen and learn, right? Or try and put some space between my disagreement and the bitterness that I might feel about that disagreement. That kind of assertion within yourself can give you room to develop some perspective, which I think is, a good habit to get into.
Any other tips or insights on this, as it were, kind of aspect of self-regulation and growth and what have you? Is there a mantra that you have when you find yourself being too quick to judge in a conversation?
I think one thing, people are conditioned to view conversations about politics as confrontations. So people sort of instantly have their defenses up, and people often are conditioned to view them as debates. And one expectation that we try to get people to abandon going into these conversations is that they're going to change the other person's mind. So we generally say, listen and learn rather than try to, dominate and declare, because you're not generally going to change someone's mind. And ultimately, if you come into a conversation like that, you're going to probably end up pushing people further into their corner. Whereas if you come into the conversation to listen and learn, but then also to kind of make your own perspective known, that tends to soften the ground and start to build a little bit of trust that, again, then allows you to work with people. Because, if you disagree with someone on 90% of things, but you think that they're coming in good faith, then it's a lot easier to work together on that 10% than, if you agree on 90%, but you think that they're just trying to, humiliate you or tear you down. And I guess just the last thing I would say is that so much of our politics now is kind of tied up with our identity. And so when people feel like their politics is being attacked, they feel like their very identity is being attacked. And so I think if there's ways to try to remember that people are so much more complicated and so much more than their politics, and they're not just kind of reduced to a binary, and that, just because they're of a certain party, it doesn't mean that they necessarily believe everything that certain candidates do, or that they embody the character of certain candidates. And I think if you can kind of just take a step back it helps you have these conversations, and also kind of, makes it easier to just exist in the world, because we spend so much time and emotion on politics, and a lot of it is ultimately just like being on a hamster wheel, where people are afraid of, if they let go of their anger, they're somehow letting go of themselves. But actually, letting go of anger makes it easier to accomplish the goals that you have politically.
How would you respond to a person who says, you can't talk with these people, the only thing you can do is beat them at the ballot box? That's one of our questions. So in other words, somebody who doesn't want to even get into the conversation because they feel it's a hamster wheel, or that it's non-productive. They might not feel it's a confrontation. They just might feel it's futile. In other words.
Well, I'd be curious to hear what Carolyn has to say, given her recent experiences.
Yeah,
I do want to win at the ballot box. I'm not going to lie. And so I think that, so as much as you might want to win, to see the people who embrace your values, policies, and ideas win, that doesn't preclude talking to them. And I think we do have to continue to talk to them, because, as I said earlier, we share a country with them. And when people feel unheard and diminished, when the conversation about why I want to beat you is because you are wrong and evil, when that's the message, that fosters alienation. And I think what we have right now are people who feel very alienated from one another. And we can have a politics of ideas where we're talking about ideas and policies that doesn't foster that alienation. And I think that some of the kind of over the top rhetoric we see are the voices of people who feel that they've been diminished by others. And then another thing I'll just point out is I think that there's something in politics that encourages people to frame the other as not just wrong on policy, but dangerous and evil, because, excuse me, that raises the stakes in winning. We have to beat them because they're evil and they're going to destroy our country. And yeah, so I think I would say that if a person says you can't talk to these people, that person should ask themselves, can anyone talk to you?
Right. And that reminds me of, go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say, I think one of the most important points to keep in mind is one that Carolyn has already made earlier on, which is that it's not just about the election. You're going to share a country with these folks the day after, right? And so we're not, the reason what we're talking about here, I think, is important, isn't so much because each and every one of you is going to go out and become an evangelist or an activist for your own political point of view. Some people are. I think most people don't go out of their way to have political debates, nor should they necessarily. But the thing is at some point in your life or the other, and maybe every day, depending on your particular family or where you work, go to school, etc., you are going to engage with, you're going to socialize with, you're going to work with, or otherwise rely upon people with differing politics. And at certain points, the tension between our differences of opinion is going to have an impact on our relationships, if it is the case that we cannot manage those tensions in a way that is actually constructive in a relational context, right? If our disagreements produce enmity between us, that begins to break everything down in society. And that's what we're seeing. But if, on the other hand, our disagreements could actually serve as an opportunity for greater understanding of one another, then we can mutually enrich our points of view, regardless of whether or not anybody's mind changes, and we can continue to live together and coexist thereafter, right? And so it's about much more than just having debates. It's about being able to have relationships and to just exist in the world, like Ciaran said, in a way that breeds comedy, in a way that allows society to endure.
Thank you so much, John. And I know that you might have to take off in a moment or two here, but we have a few more questions that I'd like to get to. And if you can stick around, just a couple minutes to take part in that, that's great. If you have to go, we totally understand. But I'll try to run through these kind of quickly. One person says, Thomas Sowell or Sewell, did you mention him?
Sowell, yeah.
Sowell, thank you. Is a living legend, highly recommended. But who, to give equal weighting, who on the left would you recommend as a Sowell type figure for people interested to hear, fully fleshed out, reasonable arguments on that side? Are there particulars you would recommend?
Sure. I mean, Professor Cornell West is somebody I very much enjoy listening to and learn a lot from. Noam Chomsky, of course, is one of the predominant intellectual forces in American life, going back decades, and very much a person on the left. A younger individual would be Ezra Klein, who Ciaran interviewed on the Braver Angels podcast, the editor at Vox, and very bright individual. There's all sorts of folks one could name. Ciaran, maybe you've got
Carolyn, do you have one in mind?
Adam Gopnik, Gopnik, 1,000 Small Sanities. I think the subtitle is a defense of liberalism or in praise of liberalism, but he actually talks about the dangers on the far right and the far left both. So which would be also the danger of limiting your exposure to one side and the other, as to toggling back and forth from Fox to MSNBC or whatever. That's not the way to balance things out, right? Start at the top, these really considered and well-developed expressions and critiques. I would agree with all those. Ciaran, anybody you want to throw into the mix?
Yeah, Carolyn mentioned Adam Gopnik. He's at the New Yorker. I think the New Yorker has several writers who I think come at things from a liberal perspective, but in a way that's open to other ideas. And I think that whenever you have a chance to read longer form journalism, there's sort of more room for nuance and more room to go back and forth with the spectrum of ideas. And I think that's one reason that podcasts are so great. And I think why John and I have had so much fun doing the podcast is you can get into a much deeper conversation and go for, an hour and a half, 2 hours if you want. And it's not just like a, quick op-ed or a soundbite. So I think podcasts are really open things up. And I would encourage, people to check out podcasts and even check out the Braver Angels podcast if you're interested.
Absolutely. I have another question here about the pandemic, which has made social life a sort of existential threat, and it triggers people's anxieties and their flight and fight responses. And the question is, how does that, or has it complicated the problem of trust that also feeds the polarization you've talked about? And how have you, or in what ways have you had to meet the challenges of a country on the brink of a divorce, it seems, that's also dealing with something like this, right? That really makes it difficult to get together, to be together, and, to have a natural sense of community, let alone, build a consensus or, achieve the kind of understanding you're talking about.
I'm sorry, I'll jump on this one really quick, just because I have to take off.
Please.
But I'll just throw out some quick thoughts. I think that the pandemic has increased the overall anxiety level of the nation, but it's a mixed bag, because for a moment at least, we really came together as a country, or sort of seemed to start to, at least, in our shared appreciation of frontline workers, people in healthcare, people in the grocery stores and the post office, who are sort of keeping the wheels turning with our economy. But we saw the overall political narrative sort of settle back in and begin to split society in polarizing ways, making masks wearing sort of a partisan issue and other things. We have had to adapt to this at Braver Angels, and that adaptation has required us figuring out how to make our programs work via Zoom, online in the digital space, whereas we had only sort of tinkered with that before. It's become our main avenue for engaging people now. But that hasn't been such a bad thing. And I'll let Ciaran talk more about that. And I'll just take the time here to say just very quickly, Eric, Carolyn, for everybody watching, it's really been a pleasure and an honor for me to get the opportunity to speak to you guys. And I hope that next time it is in person, speaking of the lockdown and so forth, because Ciaran and I definitely want to get out there and check out Kentucky. So,
you have an open invitation. We'd be delighted to host you here. And thank you for joining us, John, and best wishes to you and yours, and take care.
Absolutely. Thank you, folks. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off what John was saying, I think like so much else, COVID is a challenge and an opportunity. Obviously, in the work that we do before the pandemic, so much of it was face-to-face, citizen-to-citizen work. And I think when you're able to look someone in the face, it's a lot harder to dehumanize them than when you're behind a computer screen. And so I do think you lose a little bit of that intimacy that you get from face to face and breaking bread and picking up on body language. But at the same time, doing things on Zoom, it's a lot easier to scale, to bring people together from different locations. If you're going to do a workshop with folks from Boston and folks from Louisiana and you want to do it in person, it's going to take a lot of time and money. But if you want to do it on Zoom, it's an hour or 2 hours and everyone just hops on. So I do think there are opportunities, and basically everything is happening now online. And I think people are adapting to it. And then just to John's last point, I think, the pandemic does offer such an opportunity for solidarity. The pandemic has demonstrated that we really are in it together. And if there's a weak link, then it affects everyone else. But at the same time, unfortunately, it has become so politicized and become kind of this culture war that's caught up in everything else. So, I'm hopeful that as things progress, because I do think, as we see that the cases are increasing across the country, we're going into the winter. This is going to get worse before it gets better, frankly. And so I think that we really need to try to think about how we can use this adversity to come together rather than, letting it continue to drive us apart.
Here. Well said. And I think maybe on that note, we are approaching the top of the hour. So with that, we'll basically bring this to a close. And I want to thank you, Ciaran O'Connor, and of course, John Wood as well, who just left us a moment ago, and Carolyn Dupont for being here for tonight's Chautauqua discussion. And I wish you both the best. And to our viewers out there, thank you for joining us. I hope to see you back here in 2 weeks when we will have National Book Award finalist David Troyer to give the final virtual Chautauqua of this semester. It's our traditional Native American Heritage Month keynote, and it promises to be really excellent. So look for announcements about that. And I guess as a final word, get out there and vote. I'm sure both Ciaran and John and Carolyn will agree with that. If you haven't done so yet, that is, get out there and vote and get involved with Braver Angels and or in some other way, right, in your community to bring us, I won't just say back together, but to keep bringing us together, right? Because when this country has had challenges, it's been difficult, but we've fought through them and overcome them. And so let's continue that. It's the call of the moment. And with that, once again, take care to our guests and thank you, and everybody else, stay safe and see you next time at EKU Chautauqua.